Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's World Affairs Council of Orange County flash webinar on the Israeli-Hamas conflict with Dr. Ahlam Muhtaseb and Dr. Daniel Segal. My name is Rick Putnam. I'm the chair of the executive board of the council, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome you today and to introduce our program. Before we get underway, however, I'd like to tell you about our upcoming programs, which are in addition to today's timely webinar. On October 24th, we have Threats and Challenges on the Korean Peninsula, and on this year's 70th anniversary of US and South Korean relations. This is a dinner event. It will be held at Shady Canyon and with several high-profile, very well-informed Korean and US experts speaking to this topic. Then on November 6th, we have a trustee and premium member lunchtime update and insight onto Ukraine and the current situation there. And that's with former Ambassador William Taylor. And that will be a really neat event up close and personal with him during that lunch hour. On November 12th, and in celebration of Veterans Day, and at the American Legion Post in Newport Beach and overlooking Newport Harbor, an awesome venue if you haven't been there, we'll be celebrating US Latino veterans with Judge Frederick Aguirre, who will highlight the history and contributions of Latino vets to the US military. And he'll be joined by Colonel, I believe it is, Evan Planto, who commands that post. Finally, on December 16th, Saturday evening, the annual World Affairs Orange County Gala returns. This will be a holiday festive event featuring former National Security Advisor and Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, who will speak to challenges, the strategic challenges that the U.S. faces today throughout the world. So please make yourself available for as many of these events as you can. We look forward to seeing you there. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you today to our moderator, who to many of us needs no introduction, but Lieutenant Colonel Richard Downey of the World Affairs Council of Orange County. Richard, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rick. It's actually Colonel, but I was always proud of you, Lieutenant Colonel, but I'm even more proud of you, Colonel. It's a real pleasure to have all of you with us today. We are here on a very serious subject, and it was a real scramble to set this session up. So we really appreciate you joining us today. Those of you who are from Orange County and from California, but also we have many of you are from our fellow councils throughout the United States, and we welcome you and thank you for joining us today. Today is the session, as all of our sessions are. We take no institutional positions on global issues or policies, and so we try and present as much a balanced perspective as possible, which is why we're the most trusted forum of international affairs in Orange County in California. We don't try to bias. We simply present views and allow our members in the community to make their own decisions on this issue. But we do invite our audience members to ask questions, and as long as they're respectful, they can challenge the opinions of our speakers. And that's how we operate. And by the way, today, we'd like you to participate in this discussion. The format for this session will be about 25 minutes discussion with our distinguished panelists. Then we open it up to you. And the way you can ask questions is if you go down to your Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice that little area there. You can write in a question. And when we get to that period, we'll come up and try to get to as many questions as we can. But it is truly an honor and a privilege for us on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Orange County to have two distinguished panelists with us today, Dr. Ahlam Muhtaseb and Dr. Daniel Segal. Dr. Muhtaseb is a professor of media studies at California State University San Bernardino. She's a recipient of the 2020 Outstanding Scholarship Research and Creative Activities Award, and was also a 2019 through 20 Outstanding Research and Creative Activity Faculty Mentor Awardee at CSU San Diego. Dr. Muhtaseb is also the co-director and co-producer of an award-winning documentary called 1948 Creation and Catastrophe, which was shown at over 20 film festivals and also universities and community organizations throughout the world. And the film, which originated from her field work in the Palestinian refugee camps of Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, focuses on 1948, which is and its catastrophic consequences for the Palestinian nation. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that today, but she's currently working on a study of Palestinian digital resistance. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Daniel Segal, who is the Gene M. Pitzer Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and Professor of History at Pitzer College in Claremont, California. Dr. Segal is on the coordinating committees of the Jewish Voice for Peace in Los Angeles and also TIAA Divest. He's also a member of the Anthro Boycott Collective, and he's a past fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University and past secretary of the American Anthropological Association. And he has published widely for the last 4 decades. This past May, Dr. Segal led a study tour of Palestine for 14 faculty and students from the Claremont Colleges, which I hope you'll talk a little bit about. But thank you both for being here with us and for sharing your views. Before we get started, I know most of you have followed this situation carefully in the news, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, and I'll try to give this in as balanced a way as possible, let me just give a little overview of the situation. On Saturday, the 7th of October, most of us woke up to a surprise attack from Hamas into Israel. They crossed over they breached what's called the Iron Wall, the 40-mile long stretch of wall that separates Gaza from Israel. Also staged attacks from the sea and from the air and paragliders, and attacked. The attacks were primarily against civilians in a music festival. They went through and killed women and children in homes and on the streets. The attack resulted in over 300 Israelis killed, as well as 150 hostages. And I should mention that at the count that I've heard, there were 29 Americans killed, and hostages as well may be included in that 150. But given the savagery of the attack, the Israeli government vowed to attack in Gaza to eliminate the Hamas organization. And what they did has been to cut off water, power, food, and aid into Gaza. And since that time, they have bombarded constantly the Gaza area. And there have been, up to now, my last count that I've heard was over 2,400 killed, mainly civilians in Gaza. So there's been many deaths on both sides and tremendous destruction. And Israel seems to be preparing for a ground assault of Gaza, and they've warned 1.1 million Palestinians to move out of Gaza City into the south, to part of Gaza. But along the safe routes, they've also bombed those safe routes, which has resulted in deaths of of Palestinians who were trying to seek safety. And so now there's confusion among the Palestinians about how and where to go or to stay put. And Hamas has told the Palestinians to stay put. So it's a terrible situation on all sides. And if the invasion happens in Gaza, it will seem to get much, much worse. So what I'd like to ask our panelists first, and just earlier ladies first, the question is, how did we get to this terrible situation? It's a horrible situation on both sides. I know Dr. Muhtaseb would like to, she's offering up much of her time to give a little more context in terms of how we got here historically and some of the key issues. And then I'm going to ask Dr. Segal the same question. Dr. Muhtaseb, please.
First, thank you very much for inviting me for the Council on International,
Council World Affairs Council.
World Affairs Council. Thank you so much. And I would like to start also by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the unceded indigenous colonized lands of the Komiai First Nation in San Diego. I live in San Diego, but I teach at Cal State San Bernardino. I know earlier probably were confused about it. So how did we get here? I know that in the United States, the dominant narrative has been out of a sudden we woke up, like you said, it's unprovoked attack, but that's really what happened. It was only inevitable that this violence happens and breaks down because of what I'm going to explain as fast as I could in the time allotted to me. So the whole situation in Gaza goes back to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, when it was created and established on Palestinian indigenous land and at the expense of the Palestinian nation. Of course, there was a Zionist movement that wanted to solve the persecution of Jews in Europe, which is a great noble idea, except they chose Palestine, which was inhabited already by about 1.5 million Palestinians, including Jews, Christians, and Muslims, by the way, indigenous Jews in this case. So that creation led to the ethnic expulsion of about over half of the Palestinian population in 1947 and 1948. Those Palestinians were expelled either to other countries like Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, or even as far as Europe, if they had money to go travel, or to Iraq. Many of them are still living in the same refugee camps since 1948, including Gaza. So now we are going to talk about Gaza. So Gaza is mainly, the majority of the population are actually refugees from 1948, from the war in 1967. They first were ethnically expelled into the Gaza Strip from the Negev area, from Asqalan or Ashkelon and other surrounding areas in the south of Palestine, into a very small strip that is now the most densely populated area in the whole world, where you have about 2.3 million Palestinians living in abject poverty, in misery, constant attacks, etc. Some of these refugees, so about 70 to 80% of the Palestinians in Gaza are originally refugees, and some of them live literally a few kilometers or miles away from their villages and their towns that had been ethnically cleansed in 1948 and now populated by the Israelis you are talking about. So that context is very important to understand. Now, I'm going to skip a few episodes for the sake of time, but just to explain that we had episodes of Palestinians resisting non-violently, a lot of episodes, including the Oslo Agreement between the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was the top, considered the top terrorist at that time, and Israel, sponsored by the United States and some European nations. That failed miserably. It had a huge catastrophic impact on the Palestinians in terms of more land confiscation, or as I call them, theft, in terms of more settlements in the West Bank and beyond, and in terms of just the living conditions and suppression of Palestinians over and over. Skipping few episodes, Hamas, which is, I just want to quickly explain that Hamas is a political organization. the attack was done by Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam or al-Qassam brigades. So those are a little bit different. I don't have time to explain the difference, but I'm going to just at least say it, and hopefully someone would ask the question later to explain it a little bit more. And Hamas in 2005, so Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. And I could talk more about that, but they actually put something called Gaza envelope around Gaza, and that consists of several military posts and bases and several settlements in a very dangerous area on the border, which also we could discuss later about the existence of the settlers there. And also, so in 2006, Hamas won the elections, decided to actually participate in the elections that were done under the Oslo Accord conditions, by the way. So in a way, Hamas acknowledged the Oslo Agreement and was willing to take the two-state solution. But when they won the elections, Israel and the United States both refused the elections results, and therefore Israel started in 2007 a 16-year-old siege on Gaza, not letting in or out of Gaza at all without Israel's permission, to the extent that they started what is called calorie count siege. You know, they basically count the calories for the Palestinian population in Gaza. How? Because they control the population registry. This has been going on for 16 years, as I said. New generations were born in Gaza who didn't know anything except siege and repression, and about 6 wars, including even when Palestinians engaged in nonviolence resistance in 2018 and 2019 in the what became known as the Great March of Return, the Great Marches of Return, where thousands of people marched to in symbolic action to the borders, trying to take them down, you know, peacefully with artwork, dabka dance, Palestinian dabka dance, balloons, etc. And they were absolutely repressed. Israel killed many in the process, including paramedics, including Rawan Najjar, who was actually attending to injured people at that time. And so there were 6 deadly wars, and the world turned a blind eye. And the world now is reacting. Not the world. I can't. I'm just going to talk about the United States, because the world is different, honestly. Let's talk about the United States and some of the Western, countries. They just claiming now that out of a sudden, oh, Hamas just did these atrocities, while totally ignoring, especially President Biden, unfortunately, totally blind eye to all the oppression that has building up. And if I have time later, I could go through those 6 wars and the deadly casualties and the imbalance in power between Israel and the armed factions. I'm not going to say Hamas because it's obfuscation, honestly. It's the armed factions in Gaza, if I have time. But this was as quick as I could for a complicated history. And again, if you want to learn more, maybe you could watch my documentary, which is now on YouTube for free. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Muhtaseb. In fact, I will come back to some of the issues that you've raised, so to do a little more depth. But Dr. Segal, could you, from your perspective, from the other side, talk about how we got to this situation in terms of the historical context and issues, please? Thank you. Oh, you're on mute, Dr. Segal.
I want to thank Dr. Muhtaseb, who really allows me to be more concise. When we want to understand the root cause of the violence that has increased so horribly this week, the root cause, and let me sum up what I heard and I think is absolutely correct, the root cause is the oppression. The root cause of the violence this week and the violence on October 7th and the violence since, the root cause is the oppression of Palestinians by the Israeli state. And when you deny people freedom and equality, you are oppressing them. And the Israeli state has denied freedom and equality to Palestinians consistently from 1948 to the present. And that oppression of Palestinians is the root cause of the violence. When you oppress people, they resist. When you oppress people and they resist nonviolently, and you don't respond and support that nonviolent resistance, some of the resistance tragically becomes violent resistance. But the root cause is the oppression, and everybody who has blocked the nonviolent resistance of Palestinians are those people who blocked nonviolent resistance, who didn't support the Gaza Great March of Return, who opposed the nonviolent forms of resistance that Palestinians have asked for and that the ANC have told us were crucial for their struggle against apartheid, boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. If you oppose nonviolent resistance, you are violence's greatest acolyte. And so the root cause here is the oppression of Palestinians, and the solution is to grant full human rights to Palestinians. I do want to add, we're in the midst of horrible violence. One thing that means in the fog of war, there are things we don't have the precise answers to. I do think, Dr. Downey, that you understated the number of deaths of Jewish Israelis. I think it's significantly more than the 300 you mentioned, but none of us know. In the fog of war, facts are, those kinds of details are hard to nail down. But I do want to say that my commitment to the sanctity of human life means that I start at this moment by mourning, and as a Jewish, proud Jew, believing it's important to say the mourner's Kaddish for every Jewish Israeli life that was lost and every Palestinian life. We need to mourn for all of those lives, and we need to approach this with the greatest compassion we can for people who have lost family, loved ones, friends, whether the people who are grieving for them are Jewish Israelis or Palestinians. We need to approach all of those people with compassion, just as we should mourn for all the lives. But we're not mourning intelligently and in a way that can lead to a better future if we're afraid to name the root cause. The root cause of the violence, it is not Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. The root cause of this violence is the oppression, the fact that Palestinians lived in Palestine. Zionism was a settler colonial project. Many of the people who came were fleeing oppression. Jews who came, people, like my own ancestors, fled the oppression of Europe, early 20th century. They happened to come to the United States. Nobody should criticize people leaving oppression, trying to find safe harbor somewhere else, whether in the United States or in Palestine. But what I criticize the Zionist movement for, and why I am an proudly anti-Zionist Jew, is you don't claim safe haven somewhere from oppression and then push the people who are already there out into the sea. And that is exactly what Zionism has done. I don't blame Jews who fled the pogroms and the awful anti-Semitism, and particularly the 1930s, from coming to Palestine, but they should have pursued living in peace and respect and equality with the people there, not trying to claim Palestine for themselves and setting up a Jewish supremacist state. And that, we have to understand, is the oppression. That is the root cause of the situation today.
Oh, thanks, Dr. Segal. And by the way, thank you for correcting me. If I said 300, I meant to say 1,300 deaths. It's a horrible situation. There are probably more than that, but it's just tragic on all sides. But yeah, thank you for correcting me. But Dr. Muhtaseb, let's go back to something you mentioned earlier about the relationship between Hamas and the Palestinian people and these armed groups, the Nakba, who actually conducted this assault. I know that Hamas controls the area and governs Gaza, but do the people support Hamas? Do they not support them? I mean, what is the and these? Could you tell us a little more about the difference between Hamas and these militant groups?
Okay, so the Qassam, as I said, there have been historical changes in the Hamas movement over time. So the Hamas that started in the first Intifada became very different, which, by the way, Israel actually encouraged at that time, became different when the Oslo Accords happened, because then they wanted to be part of the peace process and they accepted, maybe not all of its conditions, but to kind of operate under the conditions of the Oslo Agreement. And that's how they got into the elections. And they won over the Palestinian Authority, which came as a result of the Oslo Agreement. And it's kind of apparatus in the West Bank with no authority, although it's called the Palestinian Authority, but in reality, they have zero authority. The Israelis control everything, the air, the sea, the land, and in between. Same, of course, for Gaza, but from the outside. And I should mention that also Israel uses Gaza as an experimentation lab for their military weaponry and to sell, arms and to sell surveillance technologies. And so it becomes a very important area from that perspective. And Hamas becomes also, the existence of Hamas becomes important for Israel to use, as a defense mechanism. And so they could say, well, we can sell you these weapons. We know they work because we already experimented them on a live population, something no one else in the world could claim. So they rejected the new Hamas that came in and were willing to participate in the peace process, again, with the help of the United States, which led Hamas to become a resistance movement again. I mean, that they actually pushed that narrative because it fulfilled, as I said, their political, economic agendas. Now, Hamas changed its charter in 2017, and it clarified that it's not in a war with Jews, but in a war with Zionism. It's clearly, people keep on talking about the old Hamas charter. Nobody bothers to even research it and see that. It clearly makes the distinction between Jewish people and Zionists, or Israelis, if you want to call them Israelis. And at the same time, probably for the same reason, Hamas separated from its military faction Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam, or Qassam brigades. So they separated totally. And Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam now operates independently, while Hamas is the political, face of governance in Gaza. Now, I can't tell you honestly how many people support Hamas. There is a big presence for Fatah, which is the secular movement that is the base originally for the Palestinian Authority. There is also presence for Islamic Jihad, for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a Marxist faction. It's very hard to tell because we haven't had elections in a long time. But I would say that in general, the majority of the population in Gaza supports resistance. As then, Dr. Segal said, it's only inevitable. People are crushed on a daily basis, and they have, according to the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, people under occupation have the right to resist, even with military or armed resistance. Now, we might disagree, of course, on what happened, but in jest, this is how people see the resistance in Gaza. In general, most factions are supported because they tried all other forms of resistance and it didn't take them anywhere. On the contrary, it led to more and more repression. So this is the best estimate I could give you on the sentiments on the ground. However, in international law, these are civilians, regardless of their views, and they should not be targeted. I want to correct the number also on the Palestinian side. Over 3,000 have been killed. In the last round, there were over 49 Gazan families have been wiped out from the registry of population. 49 families, some of them 18 members in one family, all gone, disappeared from the face of the earth. About over 1,000 children also have been killed in just the span of 1 week. And over 11,000 Palestinians are injured, and they are now being asked, some of them seriously injured, to evacuate hospitals. It's a human catastrophe, and it's unfortunately being aided by our own tax money. Instead of calling for escalation, calling for negotiations, calling for a truce. No, the US government is totally turning a blind eye. Not a single person in our government tries to even call for escalation. On the contrary, actually, there was a memo leaked to Huffington Post in which they said that the State Department sent sent a memo to diplomats and top officials to avoid any de-escalation talk, specifically to avoid specific phrases like de-escalation, ceasefire, end to violence, bloodshed, and restoring calm. You can read it on the Huffington Post, but they actually told the top officials not to use this language. And that's very unfortunate.
Yeah, thank you. It's just a horrible situation, as you mentioned, and it's the numbers are, I'm afraid, going to increase much more in coming days. And Dr. Segal, what I'd like to ask you about is, even President Biden said yes, he understands why the Israelis would want to retaliate for this horrible attack. And right now, as a result of that attack, there was strong international support for Israel. But in fact, the New York Times journalist Thomas Friedman said that one route for Israel would be to invade Gaza, to create such a strong response that Hamas would never want to attack again, which is something analogous to what the Israelis, he asserts, did with Hezbollah in the past, and they've essentially stayed back away from this. But from the U.S. perspective, and I take your point, Dr. Muhtaseb, about the U.S. not going for restraint, but they have they are trying to encourage the Israelis to fight by the rules of war, not to go after civilians. But it's, if they do go into Gaza, I mean, to destroy the Hamas leadership, the Hamas are entrenched in the civilian areas. So I mean, the destruction and all this can only cause huge damage and loss of life. And I'm afraid that this is something that the U.S. I don't know how the U.S. or the world community could continue to support that. Do you think that, Dr. Segal, in your views from the Israeli perspective, is Israel really willing to squander the kind of support that they have to inflict the kind of revenge that they seem to want to do?
Yeah, well, I don't think I want to or should speak from the Israeli state perspective. I speak from, I organize with Jewish Voice for Peace, and we are a proudly Jewish organization organizing for Palestinian freedom and equality. What I will say is that this response from Israel is like the United States' response after 9/11. It is an attempt to create security through military power. But the lesson of Vietnam, the lesson of the war, so-called war on terror, the response after 9/11, is that military responses, they may gain you a short period of domination, but that's not peace. Martin Luther King distinguished between what he called negative peace, which is peace without justice, from positive peace. And the only secure peace is positive peace. The only secure peace and safety is through solidarity and collective liberation. I can tell you, as a proudly Jewish American, I am not made safer at the expense of dominating Palestinians. My safety is through solidarity with Palestinians. I also want to say, as a Jewish American who has organized in pro-Palestinian solidarity movement for most of my adult life, and I'm very pleased that at this point in the last 20 years, particularly given how old I am, that the Palestinian solidarity movement has grown tremendously and gained tremendous support, increasing support amongst Jewish Americans, and particularly younger Jewish Americans, that at no point, and I want to say this, in the Palestinian, as somebody who goes to meetings, rallies, picnics, meals with Palestinian Americans, I've never experienced anti-Semitism. I have not had the privilege of traveling in Gaza. I have traveled in the West Bank. And again, to echo what Dr. Muhtaseb said, I have encountered in the West Bank fierce criticism of the Israeli state and Zionism that I share, but I've been welcomed as a Jew, and I've never experienced anti-Semitism in the West Bank. On the other hand, I have to acknowledge, as somebody who's lived in the Jewish community in the United States that tragically, whereas I don't find anti-Semitism is prevalent, I've never experienced it, I don't think it's significant in the Palestinian American community. The Jewish American community, like white Americans in general, harbors a great deal of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian bigotry. And we need to rid our community, as I say this as a Jew, we need to rid our community of those Islamophobic and Arabophobic and anti-Palestinian views and pursue what is the only secure peace and safety, which is through solidarity.
No, thanks, Dr. Segal. Speaking of the U.S. response and perception here, Dr. Muhtaseb, let me ask you maybe a difficult question here. After the attacks, we saw groups here in the United States cheer and celebrate the attacks on Hamas attacks into Israel, and we've also seen this in at universities. Harvard, it was out in the paper yesterday that UCLA, USC, all of these movements are saying that this is anti-colonial resistance, and Israel, essentially, so many of the liberal academics are saying Israel had it coming. And I wonder, given the ferocity of this attack, I mean, that was by Hamas, which was directly designed and purposely intended to kill civilians, is there not some way? I understand that there is this feeling about impression, but in spite of all that Israel has done, does this oppression justify operations to kill civilians, specifically intended to kill civilians? How do you reconcile that?
First, let me start by saying this is the problem when people use language as celebrating the killing of innocent people and mixing it with the demonstrations and rallies and statements that went out. These are not celebrations. So this is misinformation, I have to tell you. And I understand why you might say this, because it's all over the news. There's only one dominant narrative. And if you try to engage in any nuanced explanation, any sophisticated, discussion, you are immediately, pushed into a corner or labeled as celebrating killing innocent Israelis. That's a very serious problem here. So those marches, and I participated in one yesterday in San Diego. I participated in one in LA on Saturday that had over probably 10,000 people from all walks of life, including many average white Americans, many brown and Black people, a lot of Jews from Jewish Voice for Peace, from Jews against for the Palestinian right of return, and other groups. And they are explaining again the political, economic context of Gaza as a decolonization. Now, I don't know how to say that without being labeled in the same way. When you try to say, well, first, as Dr. Segal said, we don't know all the details yet. And it's going to take years and years for really know what happened. According to Hamas, and I'm not sure how accurate is this, according to their narrative, they did not target any civilians. They went for the military posts. And that actually could be explained because, I could understand why, because I don't think they expected to have this easy access. And that's a different question, how much Israel knew about the possible attack. Maybe they didn't know how big it would be. But according to the Egyptians knew, and they warned them about it. And I think both Hamas and Israel, thought it would be small scale, attack, airstrikes. They kill some of Hamas members. Hamas maybe take few soldiers for exchange of Palestinian prisoners. They didn't expect that wide scale. So according to them, that was their intention. When it was easy for them to conquer these posts, they kept going. As if they had an opportunity to liberate as I said, the lands where they were ethnically cleansed from. So they continued, and then it exploded into people seeing the breach in the wall, and then people started going, and things got out of control. Is this a true story or not? I'm not sure. But for many people, they see as I said, part of, not everything, but the whole attempt as part of the right of occupied people to armed resistance, to occupation, to repression, to the siege, etc. So please, at least be, careful about the selection of words. These are not celebrations. Nobody in their own mind with a tiny bit of conscience would actually celebrate the killing of innocent people. Nobody, activists who are calling for justice and Palestinians would never celebrate killing of people in general, let alone civilians. Well, we can discuss also civilians, but I'm going to leave this because that takes a lot of time to actually nuance that argument about the settlers in the envelope of Gaza and their presence as part of the strategic plan of domination by the Israeli government. But I'll let this alone because it's a can of worms. So actually, I was going with this somewhere, but now I can't remember. But in general, people who engaged in rallies, in protest statements, and one of them wanted to center, as Dr. Segal said, the root cause of violence. And the root cause of violence is clearly the occupation, the siege, the colonization of the land. So I hope I explained that, in a more accurate way than the media is trying to make it about.
Well, I wish I could, again, I'm trying to be as objective as I can, but I can understand why Hamas or whoever the supporters are would say, well, we didn't really intend to kill civilians, but the savagery. I mean, I saw, we've all seen on the news, I saw on 60 Minutes last night, I mean, the dead bodies of, just going into that festival and just mowing down people, or actually going into the homes and killing people in their beds. It's hard to take. It was very hard to take.
Well, I want to say two things. Right now, in real time, as we speak and listen to each other, genocidal acts are unfolding.
Mm-hmm.
And I have not ever, I began by mourning for, not celebrating, mourning for every life lost, Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian. But if we're right now, as we speak, in real time, genocidal acts are unfolding. Israel is engaged in activities that are clearly crimes under international law. Forced relocation, telling over 1 million people that you're going to be bombed and destroyed if you don't move, is forced relocation. Bombing in the untargeted way that Israel is engaged in is failing to engage in war in a manner that attempts to minimize civilian casualties. I believe that when this is done, we will have clear evidence that, in fact, Israel is targeting civilians. Amnesty International today, sorry, go ahead, but.
I said it's not the first time. I mean, we have 6 wars already in Gaza alone. Forget about everything. Sorry, go ahead.
And Amnesty International today released a report that they have video documenting that Israel attacked Palestinians on the routes that Israel said would be free of attacks, and so they could not leave. So if we're going to talk about extreme horrific violence and condemn it when it involves a loss of Jewish Israeli lives, we are hypocritical if we don't do the same and condemn the Israeli state. And I insist on every human life being sacred, and insist that we don't make an exception for Israel and not name its crimes against humanity, its crimes under international law. I also want to agree, the mainstream media and mainstream politicians, and I'll say one more thing about the claims about the what you call the savagery of the attacks. President Biden stood up in front of the country and the world and said he had seen pictures of decapitated children. I don't, if you kill children, it's wrong. Whether you decapitate them or not, they're dead. It's horrible. But President Biden didn't tell the truth. He'd never seen those pictures. Nobody has the pictures. The Israeli army has not been able to confirm those reports. Now, I'm not saying that children didn't die and Hamas isn't responsible. I don't know what happened to the fog of war, but I do know how easy it is for mainstream America, white America, to believe completely undocumented untruth from the President of the United States because there is a racist presumption that these are the things that Arabs and Muslims do. And that racist presumption allows a flimsy claim to become very quickly accepted widely in the United States. And again, another mistaken assumption that became widely accepted in this country was that those of us who are pro-Palestinian, those of us who had the intellectual integrity to name the root cause of the last week's violence as the state oppression of Palestinians, were somehow or other celebrating or saying it was justified. Intellectual explanation is a matter of our responsibility as intellectuals to name root causes. Saying this is a root cause does not say it was justified. Saying it was a root cause does not celebrate it. And while apparently every columnist for the New York Times and those who read them were sure there was some Hamas-loving, violence-loving left in this country, as a proud member of the pro-Palestinian left in this country, I have to tell you, I don't know anybody who is a Hamas lover in the pro-Palestinian left in this country. They're a figment of the right wing and the mainstream imagination, it is true, perhaps some statements by some individual groups, the wording wasn't perfect. People were operating under enormous pressure. But if you look at most of the statements, like the statements of Jewish Voice for Peace, the statements of a great organization, the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, the Adala Justice Project, none of those statements involved any kind of celebration or any kind of satisfaction in the loss of Jewish lives, much less celebrating Hamas. The New York Times columnists who made up this myth, I don't know where they live, but I don't see them at I don't see them at left pro-Palestinian rallies. So if they're convinced that there's some Hamas-loving left and violence-loving left in this country, I think it's in their head because it's not where I live.
Well, thanks, Dr. Segal. We'd better go to audience questions here. I apologize. I've not been stewarding our time very well here. I appreciate all the responses you've given. I have many more questions, of course, but let's get to some questions from our audience. And the first question is really about the governability of Gaza. And at the end of the hostilities, if, for example, the Israelis are successful in eliminating Hamas, this says no matter who wins, Gaza is undergoing severe bombing. Attacks are still underway. We assume Israel has no interest in being an occupying army. So what about the Arab League or some consortium led by the UN? The question is really who governs Gaza if the Israelis attack and destroy indeed Hamas?
Good. Do you want to take that, or do you want me to start?
I think first there needs to be a clarification of the question.
Well, the question is who could govern if the Israelis invade and take over Gaza and in fact do destroy Hamas? Who then? How do you manage? How do you administrate? How do you govern Gaza? Who does it and how?
Go ahead, but okay, I'll comment that.
Maybe I'm too serious in my belief in democracy, but my answer is you don't have some governance is best when it's democratic. Gaza will be governable when there is equality and freedom and real democracy. You don't bring in some institution or some outside group And the conditions of governability are questions of freedom, equality, and setting up democratic institutions, or allowing people to set up democratic institutions and use them to govern themselves. Who should govern Gaza? Palestinians should govern Gaza, and they should do so through the institutions they create for democracy. And so I, in some sense, that to me, because I really deeply believe in democracy, it's not just rhetoric. I think we should take our faith in democracy seriously, and support democratic processes rather than looking for the Arab League. I mean, the assumption that the Arab League can govern Gaza is like Arabs govern Arabs. That's an underlying essentialist assumption. No, it is ending the oppression, ending 16 years of crippling siege and control of Gaza by the Israeli state. What Israel should have done after that attack was to have granted freedom and equality, removed all of their laws that treat Jews as more than and non-Jews as less than. They should have ended their siege on Gaza, and they should have proceeded for coexistence on the basis of respecting the human lives of Palestinians as equally worthy as Jewish lives. And when you do that, the area will be governable.
Let me move to another question that is very important, actually. I'm sure you both want to address this. Question is, wasn't the original UN plan in 1947 to 48 to have two states, one for the Israelis and one for the Palestinians? I understand this was rejected by the Arabs. Could you each comment on that?
Okay, so in 1948, it's very important also to understand what was happening. The majority of the population was Palestinian, as I said, indigenous, Jews, Muslims, and Christians. The Zionist movement that came from Europe was a European settler colonial force that became very militant. And to remind, when Dr. Segal said, people have the right to run away from pogroms, absolutely. The first waves of Zionist immigration to Palestine were peaceful and were actually welcomed by the Palestinian society at that time, at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. And there was empathy among the Palestinian population. However, there was a militarization of the Zionist movement, a push for the creation of a state. Again, where the state is going to be created if there is already a population under the British mandate or the British colonization, which I forgot to mention. And the British facilitated the creation of the state of Israel by arming those militias and supporting them and pushing for the immigration of Jews into Palestine. Up until 1947, the Jewish population exploded in numbers, and they became from merely a few tens of thousands all the way to up over 500,000 in 1947. The problem is, up until then, they could not own more than 7% of historical Palestinian land. So when the United Nations resolution was forced on Palestinians and Arabs, of course, they rejected it. Would you agree to give your land and I want to see someone on this panel who would agree to this. Somebody comes and tells you, well, I decided to give 54% of your country to someone else because they claimed it's theirs when they owned only 7%, like the top number of estimation of how many Jews owned land, the number of land didn't exceed 7% of historical Palestinian land. So, of course, they rejected that and they voted like any normal person in the world would fight against being basically expelled from their lands and give their lands to someone else. So that question is obfuscation. Again, I'm sorry, with all due respect. Look at, those are repeated to us over and over because that's what the Israelis, their talking points keep on popping up. And sometimes I get tired. I shouldn't probably get tired and I should maintain my cool, but sometimes I'm tired of responding to these questions. Just study the history, read books, read Ilan Pappé's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Ilan Pappé is actually an Israeli historian who lives in the United Kingdom. Books by Rashid Khalidi, books by the consensus among the scholarly community on Palestine and the history of Palestine is almost the same. Very few differences.
Dr. Segal, what are your thoughts on the two-state solution?
Well, first of all, let's think comparatively. The United States has a historic, devastating problem of white racism. How many people who advocated two-state solution believe that what we ought to do is set up separate white and black, separate white and indigenous states? So if you believe in setting up states by partition and establishing them on an ethnic basis, why do you recommend it for Palestine, but not for the United States? And let's look at two cases that occurred almost in time within the British Empire, Palestine and South Asia. In both cases, and this is one more element that I would add to Dr. Muhtaseb's excellent historical summary, the British, along with the Zionist movement becoming more and more military and more, in fact, terrorist and using terrorist techniques, the British, in both cases in South Asia and in Palestine, worked actively to foment conflict between Palestinians and Jewish Israelis, between Muslims and Hindus. And they did this because the British state found it useful to support their rule by playing off these different communities against each other. They fostered and used it for their own attempts at domination. And then when problems were produced, the British said, the solution is partition. Let's look at how well partition has worked. What is the historic outcome of partition in Palestine and Israel? The historic outcome is violence that's never ended, oppression that's never ended. One nuclear armed state that is a threat to the world widely because of its being nuclear armed, and a state that has not ever ceased to oppress Palestinians since its founding in 1948. On the other case of partition, what do we have? Two nuclear armed states, and again, a state of endless lack of peace from the time of the partition. You know, one is 1948, one is 1949. But the historic lessons, if one is a serious scholar, is that you do not create lasting peace by attempting to have ethnic partition. You create lasting peace by recognizing people's common humanity and ensuring that in however many states you have, 3 states, 23, 1 state, 2 state, 23 and a half, or 0 states. The really important thing is that you give equality and freedom to all human beings, and that you support genuine democratic processes and you accept those outcomes. Unfortunately, that didn't happen in either place. And unfortunately, despite our rhetoric, the United States has a history of abject failure for decades of supporting the outcomes of democratic processes, and has a long history of undermining democracy. And let us be clear, Israel today, and I may have the numbers slightly wrong, this is not a game of gotcha, it rules about 12 million people. 5 million of the people the state rules have no vote. They do not have freedom, they do not have rights. That is undemocratic. And a democratic movement in Israel would have to be a movement that gives full citizenship, full equality, full freedom to Palestinians. And until the idea that Israel is a democracy is a complete myth. Democracies don't rule 5 million people without citizenship rights and without equal rights.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Segal. You know, I'm afraid we're gonna have to leave it there. There's so much more I wish we could have gotten to, and more questions from our audience, but I can't thank you both enough for coming on and sharing your perspectives. It's a horrible, horrible situation. I wish we could do more to address this, but what we're trying to do from our perspective at the World Affairs Council is to help our members better understand the situation. And I thank both of you for helping us to do that. This clearly will not be the end of this terrible situation. We'll come back to this with more for just to update our members. And I hope you will both be able to join us for some more of that. But thank you so much for helping us to understand the context, the history, and your perspectives on this terrible situation. So, and now I'd like to pass it to Jane Herring, our vice chair of the board of the World Affairs Council, to thank everyone and to close this out with some updating things. I also like to thank Krista Seitz, in particular, our programs manager, for really scrambling to help to do this. But Jane, please, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you both, Dr. Segal and Dr. Muhtaseb. I know that it's our council covers a lot of issues that happen around the world, but to cover one with such egregious human rights violations just adds another very deep level of emotional complexity. And I really appreciate both of your professionalism and your thoughts on what is happening. Thank you for being with us today. For all who have joined us today, thank you for being on. We hope you'll join us for events coming in the future. One in particular I want to draw your attention to. Tomorrow ends the early bird pricing for our upcoming Future of Korea event. That will be the evening of Tuesday, October 24th, with the Embassy of the Republic of Korea and Deputy Consul General of the Republic of Korea, along with many other distinguished guests. Again, that's on October 24th in the evening, and the early bird pricing ends tomorrow. And then we're very excited to announce that we have a gala after many years of not having one on December 16th. That's a Saturday night with H.R. McMaster. I'm honored to be the co-chair of this event and hope that you will all be joining us. Again, thank you all for being a part of this. Thank you to our speakers, and we hope to see you all again soon.